And here is Maura Carlin, who will be catching up with State Senator Shelley Mayer on tonight's roundtable.
Welcome to the Roundtable. I'm Maura Carlin. Tonight I'm joined by New York State Senator Shelley Mayer, who won a special election in April to succeed now County Executive George Latimer in representing New York District 37. That's us. And this is our first chance to have the senator as a candidate, not as a candidate,
right,
but as our elected official, to get to know you and to find out what's going on up in Albany. And you, our viewers, as always, call or email with your questions and comments for the senator. The contact information's on your screen. And we're going to dive right in because we've got a number of topics to cover.
Sure.
The session in Albany ended about a month ago.
Right.
Last month. So let's start with taxes. So reducing the tax burden for Westchester residents, particularly in light of new federal limits on deductibility for
right,
state and local taxes, also known as the SALT deductions, people are concerned. What, if anything, is going on in Albany about that?
Well, people are right to be not only concerned, but very upset about it. I mean, this is probably the highest property taxed district within Senate districts in the state. And almost everyone who owns a home is paying more than the $10,000, which is the maximum deduction under the federal law, which was passed really to punish states like New York that didn't vote, frankly, for the Republican. It's unfortunate, and I think it's wrong. And I think the governor has now commenced with the Attorney General a lawsuit to challenge the legality and the constitutionality of this provision. But in the meanwhile, we have to help homeowners and municipalities and school districts deal with this, because not only is this a loss of income for property owners, this is a challenge for municipalities and school districts that rely on property tax. And it also affects the values of our homes.
Right.
Big time.
I mean, I read almost 8% decline in value expected.
Yes.
That's a big hit for people.
It's huge. This whole hit is huge. So we did adopt in the state budget, at that time I was in the Assembly, not in the Senate yet, some provisions that were sort of what they call workarounds, efforts to give tools to municipalities and school districts to try to create legal mechanisms to make these taxes charitable deductions so that they could be deducted from your return. That is what municipalities are struggling with. I'd be very honest. Many are unclear whether this will ultimately be authorized by the IRS, and so they're reluctant to move forward. Secondly, it takes a good deal of expertise and time and expense to set up the entities that will become the charitable entities.
I want to ask you to explain that a little more. And
yeah.
then, towards the end of 2017, a lot of municipalities, including the town of Mamaroneck, allowed you to prepay
right,
the taxes that you'd already received the bill for.
Right.
And even now, I guess we're not sure whether that will be considered okay.
I think the entire perspective of the IRS towards efforts to deal with this are in question. But that
you're
being
talking
said,
about something different. You're talking about
yes,
turning it into a charitable deduction.
Yes,
so,
going forward
right,
in the year 2019, the bill we passed creates a mechanism by which cities, towns, and villages and school districts, all of whom collect property tax, to create new entities. So theoretically, if you now pay $30,000 of property tax to a school district, you could give that $30,000 to a charitable entity that the school district created and hopefully deduct it as a charitable contribution. The questions are, one, will the IRS allow that as a charitable contribution? And they've suggested no, but it's not clear. Two, the establishment of this charitable entity takes time and resources. So we are in a state where different municipalities, I've met with many, I've been meeting with supervisors and mayors and school boards, have different approaches to it. But the bottom line is we are trying to come up with creative ways to mitigate the disaster of this federal tax law, which really wreaks havoc on our community. So we're coming up with solutions. We came up with some. Are they perfect? No. But they were an effort to really begin to address this problem.
I would just take a moment on the charitable deduction ideas. My understanding was that the federal law limits the charitable deductions as well as the SALT deductions.
It puts personal income tax, real estate property tax, and there's one other tax, but it may limit them, but it doesn't prohibit a significant contribution to a charitable entity, which was the reason that this was one of the paths created under the statute. Whether it's a perfect solution, no, but again, we were really trying to come up with tools to help mitigate it. And the biggest tool to mitigate it is to undo it at the federal level, but that's not going to happen until the House and the Senate change. So right now we have to do our best to help people really who are going to really struggle with the additional tax burden that they're going to face. And again, our municipalities and school districts. It's really a very challenging situation.
Well, talking about school districts, a lot of people in this community, and let's just talk Mamaroneck and Rhinebeck schools, feel that our schools don't get the fair share of school aid, with greater allocations going to cities like Yonkers, which you also represent,
right,
or New York City. What are you doing, or what can you do to bring more money here?
Well, I'm very honored that the Democratic leader, Senator Andrea Stewart-Cousins, named me as the ranking member on the Education Committee. That means among the Democrats in the Senate, I am the person who is on the Education Committee, second to the chair. I am someone who is going to fight for more educational funds for every part of our district, every school district. I really believe in public education. I spent 6 years in the Assembly. Yes, I represented Yonkers. Yes, they needed every penny and more that I fought for them to get. But the fact that every school district needs someone who understands the funding formula, which I do, and is prepared to know the most effective arguments to get more. Every school district has a story to tell. And you need to be able to go and articulate that because you're competing, just think about that, with every other district. You're competing with every Long Island district, every upstate district, every city district. You need to make a case. Why does my school district need more? And one of my jobs will be to know every school district within the Senate district and then make that case. I do understand the beginning, a formula by which schools are reimbursed by the state. But it's not a perfect formula. It's intended to reflect the property values of every community. So high property value communities like this, unfortunately, really take a hit in the school funding formula. And then politics is overlaid on top of it. And that hasn't served us well in Westchester.
Is there a way to change that?
Yes, there is. One is sort of the district by district advocacy, which is what I did for Yonkers. I really fought. This year they almost laid off 250 people in the school district, and we were able to get additional money to forestall the layoffs. But one is making that case. The two is revisiting the formula and making it be more reflective of the needs of every district, and that's what I'm going to do.
Speaking of formulas, I've watched enough school board meetings and listened to enough of our administrators talk about how the tax cap poses a problem in particular for the Mamaroneck schools because it doesn't take into account growth in student population.
Right. Well, I think
is that on the table to be fixed?
I think it's on the table. I would start by saying I support the tax cap. The fact is we are the highest property taxed county, and we really cannot make Westchester unaffordable for families who want to move here, as so many of us did, from the city, from the Bronx, from New York, to begin to have a house with a backyard. It cannot be that our taxes are so high that people cannot afford to live here. At the same time, people want to come for quality schools, and the tax cap is a challenge. I do think there should be exceptions to the tax cap for growth in enrollment, for capital needs of school districts, for BOCES. There are certain things that should be outside the tax cap, and we're going to go back and discuss that. But I think we should not throw the baby out with the bathwater. The tax cap helped restrict the growth, unbridled growth in property taxes, which really makes Westchester a very challenging place for people who are working and want to be able to buy a house and move here.
Okay, we are going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about some more issues like abortion and immigration, so stay with us.
Do you know how to request our services? Just go to lmctv.org. Under the service banner, click Forms. In our Forms section, you can apply to be a volunteer, learn about membership, learn about corporate underwriting, request a bulletin board, coverage, DVD dubs, equipment, and PSAs.
It's all a click away at lmctv.org.
Welcome back. We're talking to our state senator, Shelley Mayer, and we actually have a viewer question. What does a state senator do?
Oh, that's a great question, and I'm glad someone asked it. Well, from January to June, we're really in Albany about 3 to 4 days a week. The budget is sort of the pinnacle of legislative activity, and that has to be done by March 31st. Unfortunately, in my case, well, I was in the Assembly until April 24th, so I was sworn in after the budget. So during that time, we are fighting, really fighting. People say to me, what is fighting? Fighting is making the kind of advocacy we talked about for our school district, for our village, for our town, for individuals that have needs that need to be addressed legislatively. We do that through the budget process and through legislation. We have legislation we should have done, we didn't do, when we basically ended in June. Now, from now until January, first place, all state legislators are up for re-election, myself included. So all of them need to run again, and there's challengers, of course, and we have a democratic process, thank goodness. And so we have that going on. Also, for me, I've moved into the old George Latimer office in Portchester. I brought my staff, and I've increased my staff. And one thing I'm doing is making it my business to be present in the community, to be at senior centers, to be meeting with school boards, meeting with mayors, making sure as I enter this new district that people get a chance to know me, and then responding legislatively on ideas that people bring to me. Today I met about some of the challenges of Metro North and what we're going to do about funding the MTA capital plan. These are big issues that we need to be up to speed on, and of course there are small issues that matter to individuals, and those are important too.
So we hope that answered your question. I want to get to abortion and reproductive rights. The governor, you, and other New York politicians took a stand about ensuring and legislating these rights and pushing the Senate to pass the Reproductive Health Act.
Right.
Tell us what that is and where things stand.
So for many years now, there has been a bill proposed in Albany that would codify, in other words, put into the public health law, the protections guaranteed by Roe v. Wade. And so people understand that protected the life and health of a mother, of a woman, subject to certain limitations. The current New York law governing abortion was enacted in 1970, before Roe v. Wade, by a Republican Senate, Republican Assembly, and Republican governor who wanted to guarantee the right to abortion, but they put it in the penal code, which is the criminal law, and it is not in sync with what was later decided in Roe v. Wade. This Reproductive Health Act is an effort to make sure that New York law mirrors Roe v. Wade. Now, for a long time, for the years that I've been in Albany, people said, oh, you don't need it, it'll never go away. Once there's the possibility that we're going to have a new judge on the Supreme Court whose position on Roe v. Wade is likely to be adverse to it, and therefore we run the risk of the Supreme Court overturning the precedent of Roe v. Wade, which for so many women and for our country was a path-breaking decision. We need to make sure New York law guarantees this right. So what we are pushing is the Senate Republicans, who control the agenda, they decide what comes to the floor, come back to Albany, let's vote for this bill before a new judge is seated in the Supreme Court.
And that did not happen.
It did not. We brought it to the floor through a procedural mechanism. All the Republicans voted against considering it. Even though I think some of them would have voted for it, they voted in lockstep not to allow us to have a debate on the bill itself. And now we are saying it is time. The risks are great.
Well, let me ask you this. If it hasn't been codified in all these years, when there was no risk, why do you think it could be codified now?
Well, I've always thought it should be for the last, since I've been in the Assembly, I've been a co-sponsor. It passes in the Assembly. The sense was the law is out of sync. You look at this law. Why should a law about our health be in the criminal law and deter doctors, make doctors nervous that they could be prosecuted? Why shouldn't the language be the correct language? There is an impetus now. This is a moment we must step up and do the right thing. And we also must assure our children, our daughters, our sisters, that New York will be a safe place to have the right that as enunciated by the Supreme Court in Roe v. Wade.
But obviously, the Republicans don't want that to go in the Senate don't want it to go forward?
Well, I would be a little cynical about that. I think they did not want to have a vote on it. They do not want to force members to take difficult votes. This is not the only issue where I feel this way. I believe sometimes you have to take difficult votes. That's what you're elected to do. And you have to be able to defend them. And some people are going to disagree, and that's fine. That's our process. But you can't hide on every vote. So my view is bring the bills to the floor. These bills of great importance. This bills on gun safety, I know we're going to talk about, bills on campaign finance reform. Bring them to the floor and have the courage to vote the way you think is right, and then take the consequences.
Well, that sort of segues into the next topic, which was Albany dysfunction, perhaps. I mean, we have former heads of the legislature convicted, associates of the governor convicted, sex allegations, a Democratic majority that's not a majority, and the impression that nothing gets done. Is that just another day in Albany, or is something going to change?
Well, I think it's slightly more complicated.
Okay.
Yes, there's been really a terrible problem with ethics in Albany, both money, sexual behavior, improper behavior that's not unlawful, and convictions and people going to jail all over the place. That's a given, and that's wrong, and we need to do everything we can to clean up Albany. And I'm in favor of a number of strong ethics reforms, which, again, I think should be voted on. I happen to think we should ban outside income. You want to be in this job? This is your job. No temptation with outside money. That being said, to say that there aren't things being done and there aren't really some very fine people, let me just always give this example, which in the assembly I sat between two young women, both under 35, representing different parts of Queens, the most ethical, took their obligations so seriously. We ought not to throw them all in with bad apples. There are some very fine ethical people. I think the Senate Democratic Conference, which I belong to under the new leadership of Senator Andrea Stewart-Cousins, is an example of what the good things you can do. But the fact is, we need to step up and get rid of the bad apples, send a very clear signal, they're not welcome there, and frankly, elect people who are going to abide by the standards we expect.
Okay. We have a question from a viewer. How can we productively affect change in Washington?
Well, I think for Washington, and there's no secret I'm a Democrat and I'm very outspoken about it, and I've been very disappointed and upset with the conduct of what's going on in Washington, and I've made that very clear during my campaign, and I feel that way. I think we have to engage more people in voting and participating. And whether it's participating in a local election like people did with mine, where thousands of people stepped up and got involved who never were involved in local elections, whether it's coming to a town board meeting like we saw earlier in the news and expressing your views, whether it's engaging in a federal race that's outside of our district, going somewhere else, volunteer your time. But there has never been a time when democracy demanded participation like it does right now. So we need to take back our federal government, in my opinion. And it's not a partisan thing. We just need to get it back so that we feel our voice is being heard. We don't all agree.
Okay, I hope that answers your question. Before we take a break, I'd like to talk to you about gun safety.
Yes.
As I understand it, there are efforts upstate to repeal the SAFE Act. Mm-hmm. Where does that stand?
Well, that's one thing, but there's a really more pressing issue on gun safety. There are several common sense, very modest bills that we could pass if the Senate Republicans, again, would put a bill on the floor. And we tried procedurally, again, the extreme risk protection order that would allow a judge to determine with the person who had a gun whether they were at risk to themselves or others with the possession of the gun. A judge decides whether they should have a gun, and if a judge decides they shouldn't, law enforcement removes it. This is a bill that has worked in other places. It's common sense. It's supported by the vast majority of people. They wouldn't bring it to the floor. There are senators, Republican senators, who have signed onto a bill to repeal the SAFE Act in every county outside of New York City. That would be here in Westchester. I think that's absolutely absurd. I think it's wrong. We need to take every step to assure families, particularly parents, that their kids are safe. After Parkland, I met with so many mothers, young mothers of young children, who wanted us to do everything in our power to ensure that guns were not in the hands of people who threaten their children.
And are there bills to provide armed officers or security personnel at schools?
Well, there's bills to that suggests that every school must have an armed police officer, which I think is not the right way to go. I think schools and school districts are very well able to determine what level of security they want. Do they want extra, I met with some school districts this week, they want extra doors outside, a second layer of doors. They want additional protections within their security system, things that cost money. They don't want a police officer. They want these physical protections. The state should put money on the table to help achieve that. I think we should leave it up to school boards, parents, and school districts to decide what's right.
And do you think any of these proposals will go forward at the next legislative session?
I think that the additional money for security will continue to be a press that I will press for and others will press for. I think there's not an appetite for having an armed police officer in every school. There may be schools where it's appropriate, but there may be schools where it really would set a very poor tone. And I was in New Rochelle, which is in this district, after they had some very challenging and disturbing things happen in their school. I was there for a big meeting where parents spoke out against having armed guards in the schools. So let's let that be a matter of local control.
We're going to take another break, so stay with us and as we continue our discussion with State Senator Shelley Mayer.
Did you know that if you missed the last government meeting, you can watch it on our website? Just go to lmctv.org, click on videos, then click on municipal meetings, scroll down to find the meeting you want, or use the search function in the upper right corner and type in the name or date of the meeting. Then watch. You can see the full agenda and jump to a specific agenda item. It's all a click away at lmctv.org.
If you're just joining, we're speaking with State Senator Shelley Mayer. Of course, you can email or call with questions, and we'd love to hear from them. We're going to end, it's really our last subject matter, on immigration, about which you've been outspoken in our news segment. Yes. We saw you appearing at a vigil. That's a federal issue. What is to be done at the state level, and what is going on in Albany?
Well, I think there are things we can do, but let's just put it in context. I say people can disagree about immigration policy, federal immigration policy. I'm in favor of comprehensive immigration reform. I thought we could have had it on a bipartisan basis. We should. That's a federal issue. What we should not disagree about is separating families. That was a terrible policy in my view. That was really not an American principle that I felt good about. And I spoke up right away. I did go to Rising Ground, where a number of these unaccompanied minors.
Right.
So that's a big social service agency located in Yonkers, where they have a number of unaccompanied minors and some separated children that they are caring for. Basically for a fairly
Had you known that there were kids separated in, I mean, we're talking about people from the southern border being
flown up in the middle of the night, 1:30 in the morning, little kids, some toddlers. I did not know they were here. I don't think that
and they were in your district.
And I don't think the Office of Children and Family Services, which regulates these agencies throughout the state, knew they were here. This happens to be a very high-quality place. I've been there many times, and I toured it. I think they are a loving and caring staff. Most important, they were absolutely committed to finding a way to reunite these children with their family member who came.
Well, what did you see when you were there?
Well, we saw older children who they've had for many years, unaccompanied minors.
Those are ones who came here unaccompanied.
They came unaccompanied, and for multiple years, they've been sent to these places like Rising Ground for 30 to 40 days before they get reunited with someone they have their relative or someone else they have in the States. But again, as you say, they were sent from Texas or the border up here to New York, and they stayed. There also were, but we were not allowed to see them, these separated children that came after Trump issued his policy, which he later said was changed, but they still have not reunited these families. And we were not allowed to see these children. We did talk to the staff about the circumstance with them. My view is we cannot be quiet, we cannot be silent in the face of this separation of families. This is our obligation. There are some things the state can do, some things the state is doing. One thing the state put pressure on these agencies to give much more information. As you said, we didn't even know they were here. Secondly, the governor has put some resources into ensuring that these children have, while they're in New York, have all the services they deserve and need because it's so traumatic. And let's not forget about the parents. Some of the parents also are entitled to a claim of asylum. They're entitled to have a hearing. There's not a presumption that every one of these people is undocumented, they may be undocumented, unlawful.
We have a question from a viewer for you. There was an immigrant question, if we could scroll back the other way. The question from the viewer was, how can we protect immigrants?
Well, I think, again, the greatest burden is on the federal government. And frankly, this administration, this presidential administration of President Trump, in my opinion, has been profoundly anti-immigrant. And I think that's anti-American. I don't support that. And so what we can do is try to change Congress and the Senate to really stand up for the kind of wonderful diversity of immigration that we in Westchester are so blessed to have and really benefit from. Whether you go downtown Mamaroneck, Portchester, New Rochelle, Yonkers, we're just fortunate. And I don't mean just from the southern border.
But do you distinguish between those who have come here and stayed here legally versus those who have, come in the dark of night or?
Well, my point to that is there is a legal basis for coming here and seeking asylum from some of these Central American countries that pose tremendous risk. Now the president is trying to change the policy, but for years, the United States was a place for asylum. It is not unlawful to come here and declare I am seeking asylum. So we should not just lump that everyone who comes to the border is unlawful. They were going through a process. They have changed the process. I'm open to a discussion about revisiting the process, but in the meantime, we cannot be quiet in the face of this separation of children, particularly young children, from their parents. But there also are some state things we can do. And we have adopted some legislation when I was in the Assembly, but we're going to go back in the Senate and revisit about doing what we can for these children and families that are in New York.
We have another viewer question.
Good.
This is a national one, international. How do you feel about Trump and the Russian news? Should we be concerned as citizens?
Well, I am a state legislator. I don't have purview over it. I personally am very, very disturbed, very concerned. I hold the president as a position of authority with the greatest respect. And I'm upset with the conduct of our president, and I've made that known. And I believe that there's a moment in time when in a democratic society you do need to speak up. This is one of those moments, and I intend to speak up.
We thank you for joining us. I hope that you will come back and we can continue some of this conversation.
Thank you, Maura, for such good questions.
And thank you for your questions and for joining us. And stay tuned. We've got more of the Local Live coming up.